Hello everyone. My name is Evgenia and I'm part of this year's Inside Out team. There are 5 of us, myself, Stephanie, Mauricio, Alex and Phoebe. We curate and organize bi-weekly lectures where we invite internationally renowned practices to discuss their work. Inside Out is probably the RCA's only student lecture series. The aim is to use these conversations at lectures to incite, enliven, and cross-fertilize ideas from many design disciplines. Inside Out differentiates itself from other lectures by shifting the content from
Recording in progress
to a discussion platform that confronts the ebbs and flows, glamour, glitz, and grit of being in the industry. We encourage designers to talk candidly about their career decisions, pitfalls, and all. Our guests are asked to share advice and personal experience about getting started in the field, valuable lessons learned, and share any professional insight. Today, we're proud to present Carmody Groarke. Established in 2006, London-based architecture studio Carmody Groarke has developed a reputation for working international on a range of arts, cultural, and heritage projects, from temporary pavilions and exhibitions to the construction of a low-energy museum wing and estate-wide master plans. Today, Associate Director Lucas Barry will explore the origins of the studio's resourceful approach to design and how these ideas have translated into a low-impact attitude to making longer-lasting architecture that looks to retain, reuse, and reinvent our built heritage. Lucas is an experienced architect specializing in cultural, arts, and hospitality projects. Joining Carmody Groarke in 2006, Lucas has delivered several significant projects for the practice, including the Frieze Art Fair Pavilions, Surreal House at the Barbican Art Gallery, and the Double Club for Fondazione Prada. He was a project lead for the extension and refurbishment of the BFI South Bank Building under Waterloo Bridge, and has recently completed the transformation of the Playhouse Theatre into the KitKat Club, an immersive in-the-round performance space for a new production of Cabaret. Please welcome Lucas.
Thank you. Well, thanks for having me. The last time I did a lecture or a talk, it was to a laptop to no one. So it's quite a nice difference to see some people in the room for once. Firstly, thank you for having me. I thought that that was an excellent introduction to the studio, and I think it really kind of sums up what I wanted to talk to you today about. Some of you might know some of our work, and I think that I wanted to use this opportunity to give you a more kind of personal reflection on how I've seen the studio develop its attitude to research and making architecture. I want to give you a bit of a reflection on how, especially in the early years of the studio, we were able to use more experimental work in smaller projects and let that, through the process of the studio growing, influence larger and more long-lasting work. Here's us. This is Carmody Groarke. Our studio's in Farringdon in London. Here's our studio full of all of our projects. Some of the early projects make a virtue out of the necessity of scarcity. Sometimes that's an economic scarcity, and sometimes it's quite literally the idea of a short-lived and quick-build project. As you can see here, this is Studio East Dining. We did in 2010. This was a project that celebrated the start, or the kind of the emergence of the Olympic Games masterplan site in Stratford, and the project was essentially a hospitality pavilion made entirely out of materials borrowed from the construction site surrounding it. And what you see here is this kind of cathedral-like quality space made of scaffolding, scaffolding boards and builder's lamps. And I think that the identity of these projects gain their sense of character from often the materials available and often through thrifty means, economical means, and are very direct in the way that they communicate how they were made. This is the filling station. So from three weeks, this project was intended to last for 3 years. And this took an existing petrol station right next to the emerging construction site of King's Cross behind. And you can just see there's Central St Martin's just emerging in the background. And this was essentially a space that created a cultural venue with a restaurant and bar that overlooked the now opened up terrace of the Regent's Canal, and literally used the infrastructure of the petrol station to gain its sense of character. It was enveloped entirely in this glass reinforced plastic screen, which essentially protected people from within. And then we literally used the shop of the petrol station as a restaurant, which became a fine dining restaurant. And I think what really characterises our work is that we're also not afraid to reference ourselves. So we use the same component of that project in the Maggie Centre for economical purposes, but it felt like a very appropriate and kind of appropriate way to make a new piece of architecture from something developed from something else. And shifting the time frame entirely to 300 years, this just shows a completely different challenge. This was a memorial to the 7th of July bombings, which is in Hyde Park just by us. This project had the idea of making a memorial out of the singular and collective loss of 4 different events and 52 innocent people that died. Each stelae is essentially cast of molten stainless steel in just 20 seconds and has a incredibly tactile surface quality to it that stands in the park. And I think that all of these projects come from an entirely open approach to collaborating. Our studio has, I think, as this school also does, has the ethos of taking in a diverse range of influences of artistic practice, of makers, and a completely diverse creative discipline. And what I hope from the projects that I'll show you is that these projects kind of embody an approach that attempts to make the most out of the least. And I'm going to focus on 3 projects that I think really capture the idea of retain, reuse and reinvent. I'm just going to show you very quickly. Some of you, I think, have already been here, which is really useful. So this is the Hill House box that is essentially a protective shroud around this magnificent house by Charles Rodney Mackintosh. Now this house is disintegrating because it's in Scotland and subject to lots of strong weather. This project essentially creates a temporary shelter, which was needed, but in doing so creates these wonderful moments that mean that you can literally physically move around this space as a visitor experience and see very up close and direct the conservation attempt to restore and kind of bring back to life this wonderful building. And in doing so, this change of aspect gives you lots of different aspects of the site, which is on the top of a hill overlooking Helensburgh. This project is probably our most well-known Windermere Jetty Museum in the Lake District in so this is a series of archetypal sheds clustered around an existing museum, and these archetypal sheds have these incredible carved out volumes that start to suggest a way that the museum takes in the inside and the outside as a museum experience. This museum has a very direct relationship to water, it being a museum mainly for boats, and it has a very direct relationship to the act of conservation, which is actually celebrated in one of the main buildings. So you can very much as a visitor see this happening, like the Hill House, in action. So I'm going to talk about 3 projects. This one is the first, 2 pavilions. Now, this is a domestic project, a master plan for a house in Sussex in the UK. It was quite an unusual client brief because the client had already built a rather lovely house only a few years before and asked us to extend it. That was a quite peculiar request, given that it's such a kind of precise piece of architecture. But they kind of, through talking to them, said they think they've got 2 needs. One is a small domestic extension for guests to stay, and the other is a studio to think, make, and relax. This is the site, so it's basically a piece of ex-farmland. The house, the existing house is right in the middle, and there's a kind of high point and it drops all the way down here. And it's a wonderful kind of established landscape of grassland and kind of semi-woodland. And the dark spot here is essentially a lake with an island. And here is a ruin as well. So that's the former house, the former farmhouse of the site. So the guest room. We didn't quite fancy the idea of trying to extend this very precise and contemporary piece of architecture. We were seduced by the setting of the lake, this kind of picturesque kind of moment, and it being quite distinctively different from the existing house. And we started to explore the idea of quite primitive forms. As you can see here, these are castles that start to suggest this kind of almost bunker-like quality with carved out spaces implying kind of domestic use, or even quite simply a rock that is kind of carved out in the most simple and primitive way. We eventually landed on an idea that we pitched to the client, which was the idea of making a retreat or a kind of hermitage. And this book that we chanced upon by Gordon Campbell has an amazing description of a hermitage. The distinction of a hermitage is something that is quite deliberately far away from civilization. So you are taking yourself away. And we thought that was a really nice idea for the challenge of trying to extend a contemporary piece of architecture. And this wonderful quote, at its core lies the notion of contemplative solitude and pleasurable melancholy. That sums up the client quite well, actually. We used lots of different techniques to develop this project. This just shows the kind of almost the sequence of developing ideas. We have this kind of idea of a single plain room, quite a humble space, but then started to get kind of character from, as you can see on the right-hand side, the idea of carving out little spaces that had all of what you need in a small domestic room. We showed the client quite quick models. This one was just made of foam and clay, and it starts to imply the idea of some kind of shelter, quite elemental and questionable as to what is landscape and what is actually shelter. This developed into a series of sketches and kind of views. This was an idea that we had to kind of literally submerge some kind of space into the landscape. And it had this kind of almost fantastical quality, an indivisible nature between the interior and clearly the lake. The scheme developed over a number of months, and we ended up being very interested in the idea of this kind of almost monolithic form that implied it was kind of, it's positioned in the landscape and quite deliberately with that very direct relationship to water, but also it starts to open up this idea that the interior of this space might be altogether different. And we started to sketch out plans, and this was the eventual plan that we landed on. So this is a 6 by 6 square meter room, so 6 by 6, and it just features the basic ingredients of a guest room altogether. And you can see, obviously, the largest kind of spatial idea is that it has this kind of access as you come in to this rather large jetty that is almost like a drawbridge. So it has a really generous sized aperture, a single bed and a single bathtub. Clearly, the question of how to access this building was brought up, and we pitched the idea of a tunnel. Quite amazingly, the client was mad enough to take that idea. So we took the idea of the existing house, which started here, and said, well, look, there's a big landscape project for this scheme done by Joe Gibbons, and that was all to be re-landscaped on top. So we said, why don't we use that opportunity to actually kind of carve out and implant a tunnel that connected this singular room by the lake back to the house. And we said it would be really fun, actually, if your guests were really surprised by this. So this is a render of the gym, and it pretty much looks like that. It's just a plain box. And we said, well, it would be really cool if we just had this secret door that no one really knew what was behind. I showed the client a clip from The Third Man. If anyone knows it, it's a film that is set in Vienna, and there's lots of these amazing evocative sequences of people running through the sewers, and you get this kind of amazing sense of light and shadow and the echoing nature of these kind of very poetic spaces. And we said, well, what if this particular place, this tunnel, drew you out, and there was this glance of something that opened up to something that felt like a piece of joinery, and that singular aperture was just that single moment that made this space worthwhile. So amazingly, we were allowed to build this, and so we started. This obviously is in construction. Here you can see the formwork as it's starting to emerge, and we work with wonderful carpenters to design that formwork. And you can just see this kind of start of the idea of tunnel being implanted. And this gives you a real sense of the site. You can see the farmland in the background and the original house here. And just here is where we were making our opening and implanting our tunnel. I should say that this took more than 3 times to pour. So the pressure on the walls themselves blew all of the formwork. So we had to rebuild this almost 3 different times with 3 different concrete pours. And you can just see, as this was a bit of a building site, just the form starting to emerge, almost like this kind of tomb embedded in the landscape. And what seems like a very kind of brutal image, but really gives you a clue as to what we needed to do to achieve this. You can see that the aperture of the tunnel is kind of set in here, and this really exaggerated parapet, which was to receive essentially the landscape back on top. And this image, I think, is really telling. So the material idea of this kind of concrete shell was given a timber board mark, and you can see the aperture in the background. And that we wanted to explore the idea of taking on the inside as well. The tunnel ended up being a series of industrial galvanized sheets literally bolted together, and they had a completely surprising but rather lovely aspect to them. So remember that Third Man reference, and you can really see how that started to come alive. All of the lighting was essentially kind of indirect from underneath this walkway, and it subtly kinks to the left. So there's a really dramatic moment actually as the tunnel appears. You come round and suddenly the doors open up to this single room, and you can see the single room is treated quite simply. The elements are just left to breathe. All of those ideas of the board mark concrete is essentially reciprocated on the inside. So these are the kind of the doors that open up. They completely shut down all of the lights, so it's possible to make this entirely pitch black. But obviously, why wouldn't you open them up? You get this wonderful view over the lake and a really intimate setting. And as you can see here, this was just after it finished, but nature has really started to reclaim this building, which is what obviously was intended, and it started to kind of grow back on. And you can just see the kind of way that some of those early ideas of kind of connecting yourself to nature and those moments of direct connection to water start to come through certain projects. The studio, so this is the second project on this site. So lucky to have one of those projects, and this was two over the same site. So this is our kind of Arcadian ruin sitting in the Sparm landscape. So this was formerly a house that would burn down and then left to disintegrate. And what was really interesting is that it had all of these clues, you know, familiar kind of domestic elements. So you had the kind of the fireplace and the windows, and the idea of the chimney was still there. And we really wanted to kind of retain as much of that character as we possibly could. We removed some of the vegetation, but not all of it. And we were very careful to document this as almost a piece of archaeology. We had a series of ideas about how we might explore the reappropriation of this building. We said we could just let it ruin and it could just be a folly in the landscape. But we rather like the idea, coming back to that idea of the hermit, that we could make some kind of primitive shelter around this, making sense of this ruin. And in the same book, there's a series of images of literally hermits, hermitage. This kind of starts to imply a kind of very elemental roof that kind of makes sense of kind of masonry support. And this tree, this wonderful tree in Sweden, does something quite similar and starts to show the way that you can very kind of subtly change the aspect from inside to outside, but still feel like you're inside and outside in nature. We showed the client a series of images, and this was just one of the kind of very provocative images that we do that just talk about a simple idea. This obviously shows the formation of some kind of roof over the structure, which went hand in hand with very provocative images of a setting that might be somewhere to make art, that might be somewhere to relax or take in the wonderful farmland setting. Now this image shows the way that the idea of this building might come from actually making a series of apertures that make sense of different parts of this site, and that perhaps those apertures also might be a structural way to tie this building together. So each of these, whether or not they're a deep kind of entrance hood or a large facing north window, or a very deliberately small window facing south to limit sunlight, each of them has a kind of direct relationship with other parts of the site. And what you can also see here is how this simple idea comes together in just three materials. So the existing masonry is left. The concrete essentially fuses the whole building together, and then these core 10, eventually core 10 hoods start to open up the apertures and make it useful. We showed again images, just simple collages about how the material kind of texture might come together and imply kind of these moments. We developed this project with both an amazing builder, an amazing structural engineer, and a blacksmith that happened to live in the village, which is almost kind of storybook stuff, but it's true. Ben, the blacksmith, he helped us make this. And we started to talk about some of the nature of how we could form this roof. So we said, well, look, we've got the idea of these four apertures, and we love the idea of this becoming almost like a kind of monocoque, and that perhaps the inside of it might be more figurative, but the outside very abstract, and that makes sense of the inside and makes a simple series, well, two simple spaces over the difference between the two elements of the old house. Let's keep all of that and use that as the identity of this building. And we made lots of little models. This one was photographed in our studio, but we kept on bringing these to site. And we didn't really draw very much of this project. We did some basic sections and elevations, but to be honest, most of it was developed through model and through approximation. So a lot of it was kind of dependent on the sequence of building something and learning from that process and seeing how it came out. We also, with Ben, we
we explored the idea of how we could actually make this in reality. And he said, well, it's basically like building the hull of a ship. So that's basically what we did. We figured out a series of ribs, which essentially become your structural organization. And then over that, they were sheet metal, literally 5mm thick Corten steel was welded in situ onto that metal frame. And this is just a simple section that shows, so you've got a simple change in level. Now that might look like a kind of humble space, but I'll show you some images in a minute that show the kind of scale of that, because that was one single house and we've made it into one single space. And this shows the 2 levels, so the upper space, which was what we said for thinking, and this one for making. And the formwork, making the concrete walls, this was literally cast, as you can see here, the formwork is literally cast over the top of the masonry. So what that does is it fuses the masonry together, it kind of safeguards that existing structure, and it starts to then make sense of the starting point of this. And you get these wonderful moments where the kind of juxtaposition of existing masonry or this new polished concrete and the vegetation that we were very keen to just let live and take over. You can see here the emergence of the cruciform kind of almost ring beam. So this is how the kind of shape of the roof was made. We kind of negotiated where this was, depending on how the concrete was struck. So we took that out and said, okay, these 2 points in space, let's say that these are the angles, and we'll work out the rest from there. And then Ben, that's actually Ben's mate, but Ben basically got up on the roof and started welding. He had to stop every time it rained because he uses an arc welder, which is full of electricity. So you don't want to be standing on a conductive surface in the rain, shooting electricity through it. But you start to see the emergence of the interior. So that idea that we talked about earlier of this having a kind of almost ship-like quality starting to emerge inside. And the idea of kind of the maker's marks being left, we were completely happy with that. And actually the imperfection of this building is really what we were driven towards, that kind of humble and very primitive form of making, it being very communicative of how each material came together. And again, I mean, this shows, so this is Win, the project architect, that's Ben. And this just shows you the scale of the space, which I think is quite remarkable. And the fact that this is the entrance kind of hood that looks through to the maker's space and then up to the large north-facing kind of writer's window. That's me on the worktop, which links the 2 spaces together. So you can essentially, this is for kind of pottering around, for making clay heads or whatever the client wanted to do. And you just see how these start to come together as a series of materials and spaces. And I'll just go back. That, if you remember, that's the fireplace that I showed right at the start, now reinstated, and was used again for a fire, actually. And again, the kind of hall-like quality, so you can really see how that existing gable was completely left left in situ and fused together now with these 3 materials. Sequence of spaces, very rough and quite honest materials just left to do their thing and age. This is Corten, so eventually this will go bright red as it oxidizes. And here you can just see the very kind of direct nature. This was completely intentional, but we really like the idea that actually the kind of boundary edge of this building would just get overtaken with nature once again. So we deliberately didn't put load of hard standing around this. In fact, we just said, well, it'd be really interesting just to compact the ground a bit and see what happens. So the client eventually agreed to that. And these are some completed images of the building in its landscape. And I wish one day we'll get some pictures of this landscape having reclaimed that building once again, I hope. I'm just going to quickly talk about the KitKat Club. Now, some of you may have been here. So we were invited to do a rather amazing project. This is the Playhouse Theatre in London. Now, if anyone has been there, you'll know that it has a particularly Victorian kind of quality to it, with all the frills and kind of fussiness of a Victorian theatre. So this is a listed interior, 3 levels, and a very kind of simple relationship of audience and stage to one side. So a pretty classic kind of arrangement. And we were invited, I think this is kind of really worth showing you, but basically we were invited to do this project in March 2021. And at the time, the country was in lockdown. So to get a call to say, do you want to do a completely crazy reimagining of this existing theatre to open in just 9 months, seemed a bit implausible at the time, but we were very glad to take that up. It cheered us up no end. So we were commissioned in March, and actually the space opened in November, less than 9 months after we were first commissioned. And this was for Cabaret is essentially the show that has been revived for this space. And if you don't know, Cabaret is essentially a musical. This is the film of the musical, but the story follows the kind of ominous start of 1920s Weimar Berlin. So you have the rise of Nazism in the background, but then this kind of hedonistic group of performers in this almost kind of naughty club that they called the KitKat Club, where anything goes. And the idea was to bring this idea into this Victorian, literally implant that kind of spirit into the Victorian theatre. These were drawings by Charcoal Blue, who essentially conceived of this. So this is another really strong collaboration with them and a whole cast of people that were involved in this project. And essentially what the idea was to completely shift and subvert the idea of performance in this theatre. Typically you get a proscenium arch, which is actually here, usually very identifiable as to where you sit and where you look at. In this version, we're going in the round, which means that the stage starts to become in the middle of the space, and actually all of the impression of this theatre is subtly just subverted. So instead of that singular aspect and kind of very one-way relationship with performers, actually performers can happen everywhere and appear from almost any part of the theatre. And I think part of this idea was actually the challenge to take the existing rake of the theatre, you can see just in the outline here, and just completely change that to make a completely flat series of spaces that actually talk about how almost a club-like space might be made. And instead of actually coming through the front door, which might seem like the kind of linear progression of a theatrical experience, we persuaded the client actually to use the stage door as the entrance to this theatre. So being kind of not fussy about the fact that this is a very back of house space, and actually being, understanding that that's part of the ethos of this show, and using the kind of virtue of this very kind of imperfect and kind of quite cluttered space and trying to make it part of that theatrical experience. And actually this is what the show looks like. So that space is dressed up in a very theatrical way with Tom Scott, the kind of art director and set designer that we work with very closely to imagine this. And this shows people coming in, and one of the ideas of this is that as soon as you walk through that kind of back of house entrance, you're hit with performers. So performers are in every single bar of this space, including above the main bar of the space, which features the perch, where essentially kind of the show, there is a kind of indivisible nature of where the show stops and starts. So it starts pretty much as you walk in, and by the time you walk out, you're not quite sure of who or what is a performer and what is a performance space or what isn't. And the auditorium itself was a kind of incredible technical challenge. And I think this looks quite simple, but this was a very, very difficult technical challenge of trying to work out how to reappropriate this existing theatre And this is essentially how we did it, in a very lo-fi way. So we stripped back the existing theatre. We had to keep pretty much everything in that space. But what we then did is kind of sleeve over the top this very lo-fi, sustainable, all made of wood, all kind of returnable to its original state, and able to be built in a very quick way. And this is the transformation of the space. And what you can see, I think, is that immediate change of scale and focus to this kind of central space and the kind of club seating around. And then again, the kind of transformation of all of the kind of new, kind of subtly sleeved over the top. And I think it's a testament to the team that lots of people walk in here and think that it was always like this. And actually, the attention to detail and trying to kind of subvert all of those things, I think, was part of the kind of interesting challenge of that project. And finally, the South Bank, the BFI on the South Bank, quite interestingly, so the Playhouse is just here on this map, and we really should get a map of both of them put together. But I must be one of the only people to have worked on two projects that are kind of literally diametrically opposite each other on the River Thames. So this is the South Bank in London, obviously, and this is Waterloo Bridge. And the South Bank essentially runs underneath, the promenade runs underneath this bridge. And this was our site. So this is the BFI's, essentially their front door. And I think you can probably see here, this is before we were involved, but what we found was a very incoherent and slightly kind of illegible entrance. And this is the national kind of centre for film in the UK. So I think it was fair to say that it didn't quite communicate what it did or what it does. And the interior was no less impressive. So essentially you had this kind of single floor, felt very kind of confined, and essentially had a hospitality function, and it just whisked you straight in. And there was nothing really that celebrated film here, and nothing really that kind of made sense of its position under this incredibly sculptural and impressive bridge. The original, I'm sorry, this is a lo-fi image, but the original BFI was this quite humble, almost hermit crab-like space that was kind of tightly fitted between the two kind of descending arches of the bridge. And I think it had a much more kind of interesting relationship to the sculptural quality of the bridge. The bridge itself was on the previous one. So the bridge is this wonderful piece of sculpture. This is actually a listed bridge, so it's grade 2 listed. So we were not allowed in this project to touch this bridge, but I think we had to engage with it in some kind of architectural or material way. What was interesting about the BFI is that first quite cute little building was then extended twice. So this has got lots of layers of history as the South Bank essentially was expanded. So all of the public thoroughfares you see today, this is in the 1980s, but essentially rather than rebuild it, they just built new layers and new layers. So it got these kind of crusts and kind of developed quite a kind of funny kind of overlap of structure. I think the thing that we started to do was look at the South Bank in general, because the South Bank is essentially a set piece that I think is experienced in a very three-dimensional way. This is a 2D image, but I think it starts to imply the nature that I think started with some of these buildings, the Royal Festival Hall, the Queen Elizabeth Hall, and the Hayward Gallery, the National Theatre, and the IBM building, of this kind of series of horizontal levels that give you lots of different three-dimensional perspectives on how you experience the South Bank. And when we did this competition, we said, well, look, we're interested in lots of different things, but there's two things that are kind of unavoidable. This is on the South Bank, and it has a very direct relationship with the bridge. So we were interested in trying to kind of make something of that. We showed the client these kind of sketch models that start to explore the idea or re-explore the idea of this top section having some kind of relationship with the bridge, and perhaps actually that you get a much more direct relationship to the existing cinema, which is kind of embedded underneath almost in the belly of the bridge, that kind of has a more direct relationship to the inside and out. and then also has a more direct relationship with the bridge itself. And we did these little sketches just to start to talk about how, like the South Bank, we could maybe inhabit some of these spaces so that you get a completely different perspective in terms of where you are in this building. And this is one of the internals. This was just before it completed. And you can see, I think the really brave move of this project was to make a series of spaces. So one ground level and one upstairs, an entirely new public space, literally in the belly of the bridge, almost kind of perspectival. If you know Stanley Kubrick's work, you'll know these kind of single point perspectives. That certainly wasn't lost on our client. And I think that what was really brave, and I think I'm so glad that we did, is persuade almost everyone that challenged us that we should just use the bridge as our ceiling. This is a monumentally thick piece of concrete. It's already there. It's probably never going to go away. And it's so thick, in fact, that actually you don't really need to service this space very much because it has so much thermal mass that it has a kind of almost equilibrium that it creates in this space, rather like being in a cave. And then you get to enjoy the kind of material quality of this sculptural bridge in a completely different way, in a completely different perspective. And you can start to then see an idea about opening up this aperture again. Now, the idea here was to bring people in through this kind of central axis, making very clear we had to be very thrifty with materials here because this was a relatively tight budget, but we used this kind of, we used the starting point of this kind of deep red, it being a kind of evocative of classic kind of theatres. You saw the Playhouse earlier with its kind of bright red seats. Our idea was essentially to link the two spaces quite literally spatially with this gigantic aperture, which means that you are not unaware of the presence of the bridge at any point when you're in the space. And actually, this space is now opened up to give you a much more kind of broader perspective of two different spaces that function as both a restaurant and a bar, but can be cleared away completely to have film nights and premieres. We showed the client this film reference, the last film reference that I'll talk about, but this is A Matter of Life and Death, which is about the passing of someone into heaven, and this kind of idea of these kind of very beguiling shapes kind of appearing above and kind of beckoning you up. And I think that became a really interesting kind of motif for the project itself. Some of you might have seen this image or even been to the site before, but clearly the architectural and kind of substantial idea of this was to make this kind of counterpoint architecture, this canopy that clearly has a kind of very strong relationship to the very sculptural and curvaceous nature of the bridge. You can also see that it quite clearly demonstrates that it is part of some kind of cultural program. It then, the idea of this canopy also sets up the idea that you can inhabit these wing spaces that quite literally fly out from the side of the site and oversail and cantilever over. And we said that this idea of the canopy is actually a really interesting one because like classic theatres and their top signs, they quite often try to communicate what they do. The BFI has a running program of not just daily films, but kind of seasons. And we said, well, it would be really cool if we could actually build this into the canopy. So what became a really interesting kind of piece of research is that we said, well, by day, this thing could have a very strong material quality that just kind of drifts off into the background of the South Bank, but by night might start to come alive. And we said, well, rather than putting some really kind of hi-fi screens in this that will probably go out of date in a couple of years' time as technology seems to advance, let's do a deliberately lo-fi piece of technology. And then by the kind of imposition of lots of different layers that start to blur that together, maybe we could use that as a kind of almost a way to create something quite distinct. And we did lots of tests. So we got hold of lots of LED screens, and these are very lo-fi screens. You would have seen these probably in the early 2000s. And we said, well, that could be a really cool way of actually communicating this this program. And we were showing this. These are images that we did. We did lots and lots of different tests using, you can see here, like different intervals of space. And what we were doing is testing the optical quality of how you use different materials to diffuse the impression of light coming through the surface. And this was a kind of image that we did at the very start of this project that said, well, you know, that might have quite an ethereal quality that isn't kind of, this is not Las Vegas, this is actually something a bit more kind of subtle that sits into this kind of set piece of the South Bank, that when you get close to it, you might be a bit more clear, or maybe a bit further away from across the river, you might be able to see these in different kind of focuses. As it happened, we couldn't afford to do that. In the first phase, I should say, it's been designed to receive all of this, and when they get the money, if anyone's got a few quid, they would gladly accept it. Kind of coming full circle, we decided to have a kind of intermediate version of this space. So instead of the glass that we had proposed with the series of interlayers, we have this kind of intermediate idea, which is using glass reinforced plastic that we used on the filling station originally, and then Maggie Centre and subsequently other museum projects. We also used the same people that made it, so we knew exactly kind of the optical effect that we might get. And actually, we weren't quite sure about how this would behave, but we were really surprised, and actually quite kind of pleasantly surprised, in the way that as the sun moved around this space, it started to kind of literally give you those kind of silhouettes. So if someone's up there, you can kind of see this very kind of almost cartoon-like series of shadows. And there you see the South Bank in relation to its more grander neighbours. But what we made sure of is that in nighttime mode, this really has a kind of chance to kind of beat its chest a bit and actually return itself to the kind of, I think the setting that it has as a kind of, you know, a national institute, but representing both kind of I think high culture and subculture. So it kind of is gritty by day and night, and kind of transverses between. What I think is really interesting about this project that probably no one knows when they walk in is that all of those layers that I talked about are all essentially in here. So we, like everyone before, we just built on top of it. All of the structure was perfectly fine, and our new structure just sat outboard of that. And you can see just the cantilever that defines that canopy above. And I think what's amazing in this drawing is just how labyrinthine all of these buildings are. And actually, one of the strong ideas of this project was that the ground plane was kind of bled into this South Bank. So the floor, these are new quarry tiles, which if you've ever been around the back of the South Bank and around the National Theatre, essentially all of the dark quarry tiles. And what we did is essentially, it's quite hard to see this because you need to be up in the sky looking down without no lid. But what we essentially did is set out a series of patterns that graded from the red as they got to the cinema, but back to the blue of the South Bank, and they literally go inside to outside. And you can see here also we made a series of, these were bespoke tables and chairs, benches that we made with another country, the furniture makers distinctly for this project, which means that you can configure this space in lots of different ways, whether that's an intimate spot or collectively. And then the building sitting returned again, once again, to its kind of setting under the bridge. I'm just going to end on this. So I think that the title of this was Retain, Reuse and Reinvent. And I think that you probably hopefully started to string together some of the themes of how certain smaller buildings start to have relationships to those more longer lasting ones. That the idea of kind of reinvention and literal reuse of what's already there is not just a necessity in kind of economic and sustainability terms, but it also leads to a more richer kind of reading of architecture, and I think that makes a more richer and enjoyable series of spaces to enjoy our places and cities. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you so much for this lecture. I think we're ready for some questions. If my colleagues can help me to pass around the microphones. Does anyone have any questions? Go on.
Thanks, Lucas. Fantastic talk. I have a question about Hill House. Enjoyed it very much, but obviously a lot of us visited that, and it's great that we get to speak to you about it. So first of all, I'm interested in if you could speak about the materiality, and it seems like in a lot of your projects you have quite a strong contrast with what's already there.
Yeah.
In some sense, it's quite unsympathetic, but it's brilliant, and we loved it. Second question on this as well is, when we were going around it, I was fascinated by the idea that we were seeing this project in a way that the inhabitant, I can't remember his name now, and McIntosh himself never would have seen this project. And did that pass through your mind, and do you have any thoughts on that?
So firstly, the material quality of this project, I think it came from actually quite a pragmatic approach. This project, if I had more time to talk about this project, I could give, probably not me, but someone else in the practice would give a lecture entirely about the brief of this project, because it started off, this was for the National Trust of Scotland, and they had an idea of just literally using a kind of temporary, almost like kind of wedding kind of tent, and then just shrouding the building. That's essentially the practical brief, to protect the building underneath. It was, I mean, you can't see it so well here, but it literally was falling apart. And because it's made of sandstone underneath, it was absorbing all of that water like a sponge, and it couldn't escape because of the cement render, which is essentially impervious. So the practical idea and the practical solution was actually just to let it breathe. Right, so we said it needs a solid roof, like an umbrella, to keep the rain out, and from there on, kind of anything goes. And we said, well, what could be an interesting starting point is some kind of filigree material that means that kind of shroud is not something that denies these amazing views back across Helensburgh, because as some of you will have been there, you get a really amazing impression because it's such a kind of steep hillside that we said, well, that would be a real shame. So we started to explore kind of different meshes and different materials, and we ended up with chainmail quite carefully, because it had an effect whereby nearly 90% of all of the kind of fresh air could pass through its surface, depending on obviously how dense it was, but nearly none of the driving rain was able to fall anywhere within the perimeter. And that's essentially the diagram of this project. So it's kind of set off from the existing building, almost like a kind of diagram of how much water can get through. So almost no rain reaches the surface of that building. So it's allowed to breathe, and it also allows people inside to see out and people from outside to see in, and it gives them an entirely different reading of the building, of almost ghost-like quality. And I think that we were not afraid actually to use a kind of palette of materials here that all were kind of in tune with this kind of original building. And I think that I say it again, it's a very practical kind of approach, which I think comes from a purely kind of economic idea of making the kind of largest enclosure that we possibly could with the budget. And I think that the brief was then saying, well, how can we use that to develop the idea of kind of literally inhabiting the space? And this one shows really well that the idea of actually getting around it came secondary to that. So the process of kind of coming up with these walkways was actually saying, well, what could be quite interesting is if people are there doing lots of kind of very kind of minute and sometimes very granular repairs on buildings, you never really see that happening. So it'd be really cool. Our lesson learned on Windermere was that is one of the most engaging parts of that experience. So we said, let's bring people up, and we literally got people over, managed to get them over. And funnily enough, this installation has been much more popular than the original house ever was in terms of annual numbers. So it really did change the dial in terms of thinking about the conservation idea first and foremost, but then kind of playing with how all of those layers work. I think some of it is just chance. Speaking to people about how these materials work, obviously there's lots of reference that fly around the studio. We were quite interested in the idea of using something kind of quite ethereal that kind of suggested the ghost-like quality of the building within. In fact, it's completely crystalline when you get in there, because it has such a, I don't know what kind of day you went, but I went on a very sunny day, and it had a really different impact on the way that you view the building. Now, that is a temporary building, so it won't be there forever, I think, probably.
Well, may I ask you on that one, because we were having a big discussion that we thought it should be retained, and I remember the guide was also saying how it was so popular.
Yeah.
We imagined that the people with the houses behind it maybe were less keen on it remaining.
I think that there's certainly an economic argument to it. I think that there's a cultural, there's a piece of cultural interpretation that has happened here that I don't think has ever happened to this building before, which I think is a really fantastic opportunity. We're totally neutral, as we do with everything. We build things to last so that they do their job. So everything here can withstand the weather of the west of Scotland. Yeah, I think it doesn't have plans to go beyond its initial 5-year stint at the moment.
Any more questions? Well, I just wanted to kind of discuss coming. Yeah.
I would say that that's going to use bridge as a route before. So I'm wondering, where do you get the confidence from to do that? And were there any challenges that you faced environmentally? You may mention thermal mass. I imagine water seeping through or noise or any other issues.
You're talking about the BFI. Yeah. The confidence came from the fact that the building had, the BFI had existed under the bridge for almost 60 years. So there were, once you're there, I should have said actually that the upper space actually was a private office. There was 2 desks. That view that I showed down the bridge, there was just 2 desks. I can't remember what they did, but they must have had the greatest kind of secret office in London. So they were very aware of what the bridge did. The bridge also moves as well, by the way. One of the technical challenges of that project, very quickly get to it, but was essentially conceiving of that whole project without touching the bridge at all. Structurally, materially, none of that is enclosed as a physical space. Sorry, I'll get to it. Oh, it's the last one, isn't it? Should have gone backwards. What's the picture? Okay, so the closest we got to touching the bridge was this, essentially this kind of top section here. So all of this is just essentially resting using a kind of, it's got a kind of rubber brush, like you would stop air seeping through a window, so it's like a draft excluder. So the whole of that space is essentially open to the environment. We had very good environmental engineers that modeled the space and could tell us basically on a good day, let's say it's very hot outside, this space will actually feel quite cool. And in a very cold day, actually, the space would feel quite kind of temperate because of the presence of the bridge and the mass. It essentially kind of keeps a very steady kind of environment. We were able to bring some secret air movement. So obviously you have to bring air movement, and that's all hidden behind these kind of vertical walls. So these are vertical cantilevers that sit on the old structure. I think I showed that before, but essentially they are sitting on the structure, and there's essentially a gap. And the diminishing arch that you can see here is like, that comes on the side. I wish I could show you this in kind of physical person, but there is like almost like a Formula One engine. Imagine the engineering to get a piece of plant inside this kind of bridge space and not touch it. Very difficult. But what we ended up doing was essentially kind of making a space that had air moving around here and then pulled out through here, and then all of the mass of the bridge retained. And it was that combination, and also just clever operation, that said, like, you know, don't put 400 people in here at the same time as 600 people downstairs. That probably will tip the balance. So just being a bit kind of clever about saying, you know, on a kind of peak day, just, you know, cleverly use, people do this anyway, really, through just their own comfort, but don't overload the space, because it is literally working quite passively with almost no controls whatsoever. Did that answer the question?
They were the main challenges.
Yeah. So the bridge itself moves 120 millimeters north-south as it expands and contracts. So that's why none of, you know, you can't build glazing that tall and have it resting against the bridge. I think someone worked out the weight of this bridge. I can't remember how many millions of tons it was, but essentially it's very heavy. It's going to crack that glass straight away. So all of this, and I described it like a hermit crab, the original building. We were quite inspired by that idea that it kind of fits quite tightly and actually just uses the three-dimensional quality of it to inform that space in the first place. The previous office, the line of the office was here, so that it had almost 6 meters of void, probably about 60 years worth of dust above that as well, which was rather unpleasant revealing. But yeah, that's how we did it.
Another form question. Would you be able to talk a bit more about the filling station and how you came to that inverted curve form?
Yeah,
Also
yeah, sure.
What the glass
Glass-reinforced plastic, GRP. Yes, I can. So again, the form of this was actually derived from the need to make this a freestanding filament. So the way that we designed this originally was actually just a screen that we said we didn't quite know how we were going to achieve this project. By the way, we kind of pitched this idea to Argent, who owned the site. They didn't come up with it. We took a project to them. King's Cross was being built in the background, and we said, we're good mates with these restaurateurs, Bistro Tech, and maybe we could do a joint project. And there was almost nothing this site time other than the Guardian building is just to the right. That just opened, but there was nowhere to get a sandwich other than Pret, really, down the road at King's Cross. And this is a really busy road. This is Goods Way. I think I'm right in saying that, Goods Way. And then you've got another busy road up here, thousands of taxis. So we said the purpose of this screen is essentially to literally screen the people within, and also make quite a surprising and quite an interesting approach to how the interior is very different to the exterior. And these, because this petrol station roof essentially existed, but it didn't have any structural capacity, we couldn't touch that. So we said, well, the next best thing is actually having something freestanding. So the shape of these curved inclines was actually to make them stand up. So the back of them has this kind of flange that sticks out. And essentially, if this was a flat section, then it would just flop over. But because of the incline of it, that that gives it a kind of rigidity, which means it doesn't flex altogether. So if you do a series of flat panels, essentially what they want to do is fall over all at the same time. And what the curve does is it actually disturbs the air moving around it, and it also gives it rigidity. So it kind of almost makes it into a kind of I-beam, if that makes sense. So we didn't come up with that idea. That was this lovely guy that usually makes canoes. And he said, well, like we approached him, we were trying to find someone to make a panel for us, and we were quite interested in the kind of optical quality of this, because it, if anyone saw this in real life, it basically was lit from behind. So that's one of the kind of ideas that we explored many times. But this could literally project artificial light through it, but by day it looks quite solid. And he said, well, I kind of, basically my day job, I can make this for you, but my day job is making canoes and kind of rafts in the same way. So what you basically do is make a barrel, and then you layer the glass reinforcement, and you essentially overlay. We use the bio resin here to kind of fuse it together, which is why it's a bit green. And that's what gives it its shape. And we said, well, given that it's got that shape in the first place, we then started to say, well, maybe we should actually use that as a kind of motif for the wall itself. So the wall, that was very much an architectural idea, but you can see almost the BFI in reverse here, where the curvaceous nature of the screen is counterposed by this kind of very geometric petrol station roof. So it all came from quite fortuitous, but very, you know, we're a curious studio. We look for references in anywhere we can find them, and often speaking to people that make canoes or that, you know, well, boats. Both happen to be vessels there, but essentially that's how we kind of explore the kind of physical properties of some of these materials.
Because was that made as a module, and then they were positioned differently to give the
Exactly. Yeah, so they're set out. So each one is exactly the same. So it's one mold. And we cast that mold. I think this was about 160 times for this project. So it took about 2 months for him to make all of these. We made this really quickly. This was made in less than 6 months from planning to opening. And each one has essentially a kind of flange at the back that's got a bracket, which means you can clamp them together. Then there was an occasional piece of scaffolding, which is basically just kind of for wind loading purposes, you have to anchor the whole thing because it could act like a sail and fall over altogether. But essentially, it's all freestanding. It sits kind of in relation to each other, and you can basically start to get very kind of interesting curves from the same shape. And we used the exact same mold. So the guy kept the mold. He said, we rang him up and said, we've got another project for you. So this, when we went to, we were commissioned to do a temporary project for Maggie's. So Maggie's in Clatterbridge in Liverpool. This, I didn't talk about this, but essentially Maggie's had procured these kind of, basically kind of cabins. You know, you see those by the side of roads or on construction sites, and they didn't really, they needed a facility while their main one was being built in the Alderhay hospital. And they said, well, would you be interested in doing a temporary project kind of shrouding this this interior? So we said, well, if you've got no money, we've got an idea. We're very open-minded to just literally reusing that. So we used the same material, same mold. We actually made these a bit shorter, but it's essentially the exact same geometry. So we knew exactly how it responded. And there was, in this version, actually, we could plant lots of trees. So we had trees planted in the ground and trees planted around it that gave lots of those. So I should have really guessed that you're going to get all these shadows when we did the BFI, but essentially that was the kind of exploration of that idea. And I don't think it will be the last time we use either that module or that material, I'm sure.
Are there any more
Yeah,
questions?
it's a quick one. You've mentioned a lot of sort of craftsmen and interesting suppliers that you've collaborated with, but I'm interested to know how much or how far you allow that specialism and those craftsmen to kind of inform the architecture. So, you know, where's the kind of line? How do you manage that collaborative process?
Yeah, I mean, that is, I think it's always a judgment, isn't it? Because some of our work, I'm just going to flick to this project. This is probably the best example of how we made the most of someone's specialism. So Ben, the blacksmith, sorry. Let's get to this. So when we were working out this project here, so we had no idea whether or not that point didn't exist. That's just a kind of coordinate in space. We had no idea that that point existed. We had to kind of, as architects, kind of suggest the starting point of an architectural idea. In this case, the kind of 4 apertures in the roof, and the idea of working with this craftsman, in this case a blacksmith, was about the kind of almost the practical nature of how to, you know, in some cases physically get sheets up to a certain shape, but also how the sheets might behave in different conditions. And we, as I said before, we used barely any drawings on this project. So the really difficult thing about this project is that you couldn't predict necessarily how any of the sequences of restoring the brickwork, which was by no means kind of fixed, it was all crumbling, to then fusing the concrete around it, to then kind of almost kind of drawing using steel, you know, the core 10 in real life, and saying, well, you know, here's our model and here's what we would like to happen. So we said, okay, if in a way it's kind of algebra, if you can make point A meet point A and point B meet point B, then we're happy. And we were quite encouraged. I think this obviously comes from working with someone quite closely and gaining their confidence and understanding what they can do and how they read drawings or models. And in Ben's case, he saw a section, he said, I don't understand what that is. I mean, he literally works with his hands all day long, you know, forging gate posts and like really frilly fences. He's a great blacksmith, but he's never done anything like this. And we basically said, well, look, if we can kind of condense it down into this idea of just like these kind of coordinate points, then you tell us how the material behaves, and we'll design it and kind of chop it around. And that's actually what we did. There's plenty of other images of this project where, funnily enough, the engineer got one of the sheet sizes wrong. So, you know, for example, you have this kind of almost cantilevered section which kind of hangs between these 2 points. And he ordered, we tried to, as best as we could, cut these to size. And this thing came along, it was kind of flapping about 2 meters over the side. And we're like, Ben literally had to kind of slice using a kind of, like a ruler made of metal. And then rather than a Stanley knife, a welding, you know, a kind of arc welding torch to literally slice off bits of this building. And we said, well, as long as it's straight, it's over to you. So I think we're very open-minded. I mean, I think that it has to come from the point of view of being open-minded and kind of listening to how their specialism can inform yours, because essentially what we do, we curate, you know, all of these specialisms together. In some cases, like the Playhouse, we had very little impact on actually the colors and textures of some of the scenographic settings of that project. What we were trying to do is trying to physically make it work and use and encourage as much as we could using parts of the existing building in interesting ways. So I think that is just a, I don't know, I think that all comes down to an ethos of just being open-minded and using the kind of disciplines at your disposal to make architecture richer.
You find that your clients are receptive to that approach as well. I feel like that's you know, a sort of nice creative idea, but
Yeah.
selling that to client is a different matter.
Yeah, that is hard. That is hard for sure. On this project, Ben lived in the same village as this project, so that was quite fortuitous. It can be quite difficult, and I think that there has been projects where we've kind of stuck our neck on the line a little bit and said, you know what, we only really want to do this with these guys and no one else. So it's kind of a take it or leave it situation. I think that we tend to find clients that are quite common, kind of, you know, like-minded, I should say. So the kind of moments of dispute don't often happen, but I think that's all the judgment of the melange of all of the people that come together to make architecture and spaces.
We have time for one more question, so go ahead.
I'll try and close the glass. Your projects will have a sensitivity to time, whether, you know, you said yourself that the buildings are kind of intend to last for a certain amount of time.
Yeah.
Especially with the Hill House project, being conscious of how long something lasts, and thinking about the deconstruction of that, and the types of collection we use. When you're designing more permanent architecture, I mean, I think of the BFI and any of the projects you're working on in the office. Is there a thought process about this building is going to last 25 years? This space will be usable for future.
Yeah.
Is there a thought process similar to those kind of projects where you're thinking about what happens at the end, or do you design for someone else to come in and reuse what you?
Yeah, I think there's two parts of that. One is that for sure that conversation is kind of at the start of every project. The implication of time and how buildings either resist or allow the passing of time and the effect of that by the nature of weathering or wear and tear. I think that we take an approach that doesn't attempt in many ways to kind of deny that passing of time. In fact, just say the imperfections of some of these buildings and the way that they're put together and the way that they respond to nature, whether that's something going rusty or, you know, quite literally the landscape around it submerging over the top. That's something that we're very conscious of. You could probably see that all the way through that work. We try and design buildings that are long-lasting because a long-lasting space is more sustainable if you can ensure that that space has a certain kind of flexibility. I think there's certainly no I think surprise that a lot of our spaces look and feel like warehouses. They essentially make quite kind of precise ways of forming a very large and often very open space beneath it. So the idea is usually form not everything so precisely around one individual function that may change over time, but actually just make good quality proportions of space that can be lots of things over different phases of its lifespan. Lots of our projects have come and gone. Lots of them were intended to last only for a short amount of time. And you can see the approach, certainly with Studio East Dining, where all of the materials literally return back to the building site and were reused and probably are somewhere else in the cycle of London building itself. And I think that there can be a poetic reading to that as much as there is a practical and kind of necessity to it. And I think that more and more buildings are going to have to start from the basis of what is already there and kind of add to it. So I think that we kind of design spaces so that structure has this kind of, you design structure so that it has a kind of longevity, and around all of that, everything else kind of is part of the kind of passing of time. I guess the exception is of course the memorial, which was designed deliberately to outlast all of us in this room and all of our future generations. So I think that there are different responses to different challenges of how buildings respond to their time and place. And clearly that one, the intention there is to memorialize an event for the nation for many generations to come. I think it is fundamental to what we do, and I think it's also fundamental now, and the responsibility of architecture to think much more clearly about how buildings respond to their time frame, so that when we're not building gregarious and sustainably exploitative buildings. Let's build buildings that last the appropriate amount of time with formed or impacting the most out of the least possible impact that we can have on our planet. I think I'd like to think that the story of those projects tell that story in some means.
Well, I think that's a good note to end this lecture. Thank you so much for coming and for giving this amazing lecture.